Hello, my friends, and welcome to the podcast Notes to Self. My name is Melanie, and I am going to be doing a series on notes that we make to ourselves as we go through our lifetime. Notes such as when we have an experience that might be a little bit tough, or we're learning a lesson on it, we might make a note to ourselves that we don't want to we want to stay away from that kind of an experience, or we want to do something different. Or when we have a positive experience, that we want to make note of the positive experience as well. So I decided to create the podcast and name it Notes to Self. As I was a young child, a young woman growing up, I watched a lot of the women around me and I made notes. And I would say, as I would see these different women come in and out of my life, I would notice the different attributes and characters of these women. And I would say, oh, I want to be like that, and make a note to myself that those are some of the characteristics that I wanted. I also saw some women who would come into my life, and I didn't care for the way that they were. And so I would make notes. I don't want to be like that. I want to be, I would try to make my notes very positive, very uplifting. So I decided to name it Notes to Self. Also, I want to be able to talk about a lot of different ranges of conversations, and Notes to Self just helps to be able to have those different kinds of conversations, from experiences that we have as a child to experiences that we have as an adult. So I'm really excited to be able to dive into quite a few different subjects. One of the biggest things that I wanted to talk about, I was raised in a very extreme religious community. And a lot of my family members have recently decided to go public about some of the ways that we were raised. And I felt like some of the ways that they were being portrayed on the platforms that they were choosing were very, there was a lack of integrity there, a lack of telling the truth by the platform and the moderators. So I wanted to create a platform where people can tell their stories and truths can be told in a more integratable, honest way of their experiences. So I was actually born and raised in a polygamous community, which is an offshoot of the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah. Both of my parents converted into this polygamous community. My mom converted, I think, when she was about 17. My dad converted when he was about 17 as well. So my dad came from a family of 11 children. Both his parents did convert, and all 11 children converted. My dad was the oldest, and my mom is the only one in her family that converted. So they decided to raise their children in this community. My mom is a second wife, and I am her first child. So in this community that we grew up in, my grandmother had 11 children and all of them converted. They all had multiple wives, multiple children. Last count, I believe there was over 300 grandchildren. And I am the fourth oldest biological grandchild. And I am actually the first child that was born into polygamy, as a result of a polygamous relationship, with my mom being the second wife. So that came with a lot of energy, both ways. One side of the family, one side looked at my parents as if they were apostates from the church that they had, left. And I was the evidence that they had left this church. I was treated extremely poorly by quite a few family members because I was that evidence. I actually did have a great grandmother who, when I was about 5 years old, my mom took me to California to Disneyland with my grandma. So it was my father's mother's mother who looked me in the eye when I was 5 years old and told me that I was an abomination and should never have been born and did not belong here. And as a little 5-year-old girl, I really tried to grasp onto that. Like, is that true? I didn't have any evidence that proved otherwise. So I held on to that belief for a lot of years in my lifetime, because somebody who was biologically programmed to love me didn't. So there was a lot of energy that came with that. Also, on the flip side, there was a lot of energy that came with that because I was now the evidence that my parents were living a higher principle and a higher law. So I've had a lot of navigating to work through growing up, and, learning the different ways that emotionally I was really damaged growing up because of some of these situations. So when I was, so part of this podcast is I want to be able to talk about some of these kinds of situations and also find the magic in what did I learn? Who did I become? What were some of the benefits that some of these experiences created in me? Who did I become because of this, because of these experiences? So out of the 300 plus grandchildren, I was actually the first one to marry into the polygamous community. And I was also the first one to leave. Nobody ever left. Once you were married in there, you were married forever, for all of time, all of eternity. So when I left, and I'll do a whole podcast around all of that, but when I left, there was a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of sadness, a lot of threats, it felt like, to my eternal salvation. So I've really had to do some deep diving in learning how to heal through some of these and to find my value and find my worth and find why am I here? Who am I? What am I doing? And all along the way, I kept these little notes to myself so that I knew why I was doing what I was doing. So one of the things that, as I was getting prepared to start this podcast, one of the things that really I was looking back on, what are some of the earliest memories that I have that I did start taking notes to myself. One of them, I was actually about 3, maybe 4 years old, and my mom would tell me this story quite often as a child. She would tell me, we lived in another home with another wife who was starting to have children as well. And I said to my mom one time, Mom, why does our dad love them more than he loves us? My dad loves my sister, my brother, more than he loves me. And of course, that was devastating for my mom. She didn't want her children to be treated any differently than the other children were being loved. And so it really got her thinking and got her to make some hard decisions. My mom was raised in a very abusive situation. She did not have an example in her life of a woman who would stand up for her children. So at that point, she decided that she needed to take her children and move away from this situation. She didn't divorce my dad or leave my dad, but she decided that she was going to pack up her children and she was going to move. And so there was 3 of us at the time, and she did everything she could to find another place to live. And so we found a basement apartment. We lived in this little basement apartment for several years. One of the things about that is that she would tell me that story as if, she was trying to, you said this to me and it was important to me that you felt loved. And so I moved. Well, what that did to me and of course my mom meant no ill will by this, but what that did was it, stifled my voice because I was afraid that if I spoke up and said anything, I would cause separation. My voice caused separation in families. And so I stifled my voice a lot. I was afraid of my voice. I was afraid of the things I would say and the things I would do, that they would cause harm. So I stopped speaking up. I stopped talking out. I stopped saying a lot of these things. I do tend to speak my mind frequently and now, but it was a lot of years before I believed that my voice was safe, that it didn't cause separation. And of course, my mom meant no harm. And during these podcasts that I want to create, it is about telling us our stories, telling our notes that we've made to ourselves, our healings, our awakenings, our, enlightenments and awarenesses. I absolutely love my parents. I have no ill will. I've healed through a lot of the healings with them. So some of the stories that we might go through they might be hard. Because some of them are very hard. We grew up in a very traumatic situation, yet I don't hold ill will for my parents. They're just part of the learning process. It's just part of moving through things. So as I was preparing for this podcast, I was, looking back on this earlier experience, and I was thinking, what could there be magical out of that? Well, one of the things that I discovered is that because my mom did grow up in such a traumatic situation where her own mother didn't stand up for her, she didn't really have that example. She didn't learn that from anyone. It was the first opportunity that my mother had she would have been 20, 23, 24 years old, to stand up for her children. She went, my children are more important to me, and making sure that my children are loved are more important to me. And so she did. It was a scary step because you just didn't do that. You saved face and you made sure that the family looked good at all costs. Well, this didn't make the family look good for my mom to be able to pack up her children and leave. And so she took a lot of, grief about that because she didn't want her children to be raised like that. And we actually stayed in our own home until I was 16. And then at 16 years old, we moved back in with another wife on my 16th birthday. And so it was a huge opportunity for my mom to find a level of empowerment that as a mother, she went, my children are more important to me. And what a huge opportunity for her to be able to see that and learn that and know that that was an important thing to her. So in the magic, or in the mess of that moment, that could be some of the magic. So that could be a superpower that she learned that she would take with her throughout her life. And not to say that she didn't struggle with that throughout the rest of her life, because, once we learn something once, and then we're given opportunities to learn it again and again and again until we get it down. So that was one of the biggest awarenesses that I had as I was getting ready for this podcast. So, and then also, why did I think that how come I stifled my voice for so many years? What caused that? So then I was looking back, remembering some of the situations, especially with my great grandmother, when she said that to me. And it was such a visceral experience. I remember exactly where I was standing in her living room in California. And I was playing with a doily that she had next to her couch, and I was rubbing the doily. It was so soft. And she just looked at me, and she was so disgusted that I even existed. And I remember crying and walking outside and going out there and laying my head against her house and thinking, what did I do? What is wrong with me? Why would she treat me like this? Why would she say this to me? And of course, my mom had no idea that any of this had gone on. My grandmother didn't know that my great grandmother had said these things, but she actually went to her deathbed never accepting any of the other children that my dad had with any of the other wives other than the first wife. So as I've gone through a lot of my healings in my lifetime, that has been a big one for me, because I really had to question and find, should I even be here? Why am I here? And so, and the fact that I was the evidence that my parents were apostates from the mainstream the mainstream LDS church. I was that evidence that proved that they had gone astray. And, and then when my parents would take us to church, I was on the flip side, like I said, the evidence that my parents were living a higher law, or so they thought at the time. And so we definitely had a lot of experiences to heal through and work through. And, those are just a few of the early traumatic ones that kind of came up that really shaped and molded who I was and what I wanted to be with my life. And if I even felt that I had the right to have anything in my life. And so just kind of a quick overview. So that's really why I wanted to start this podcast too, is to be able to find that voice inside of myself and not have that fear associated with it. Knowing that what I'm saying and what I'm doing actually empowers people. It moves people. It creates, and taking away some of that fear that I hurt people with my voice or that I cause separation. So a lot of this podcast really is for my own benefit because I really want to work through some of that fear that I've had growing up, some of that unconscious fear. So in creating some of these podcasts, that's going to be a lot of the magic that I'm going to be looking for. So a little bit more overview of my life. I am my mother's oldest children. My dad had, um, well, when I was growing up, he had 3 wives. We had 36 children. He's now up, he's now had quite a few more wives than that. But as I was growing up, that's what we had, and I was my mother's oldest child. So there was a lot of responsibility that came along with that, and I actually went through 3 marriages and 2 divorces, and I have 5 children and 2 granddaughters. So a big portion of why I wanted to start this podcast is for my granddaughters. I want to be able to clear up some of that energy about my voice and being able to speak up. And I really want them to see an example. And so I feel like from the last, I'm in my late 40s now. So I got married at 8 days after I turned 17, had my first child 9 months later, and had my second child at 19. And so my first divorce at 25. So, and I'll do a podcast around some of that as well, so that there's a little bit more depth. And I left a polygamous community when I was 22 years old. And up until that point, no one had left. You just didn't do that kind of thing. And it was a devastation and an upset. I was treated so extremely poorly, especially by my grandmother. So that was really kind of a hard experience to go through. Very, very poorly when I decided to leave. But I had a daughter. So my oldest is a son and my next one is a daughter. Well, when she turned about 2 years old, I was watching her and I just realized that I didn't want this life for her. I didn't want these experiences for her, and that I wanted her to know that she had so much more available to her. And growing up in the community that we grew up in, you just didn't have a lot available to you. There was an expectation to be a certain way, do a certain thing, fall in line a certain way. And so there just wasn't the opportunities available back then. And one day as I sat watching her playing, I thought to myself, I want her better for her. I want her to know that she's valuable and she can do whatever she wants to do. And I also wanted my son to have an example of how to treat the women in his life. And he wasn't getting that. He certainly wasn't getting that from them, from the man that helped produce him. And he certainly wasn't getting that from the environment that we were in. And I wanted him to be able to know how to treat the women in his life. So I packed up and left about 22 years old, and then ended up getting divorced and getting remarried at 27. And so I feel like I've had a lot of really deep life experiences throughout this 49 years. And I really want to be able to work through and deep dive through some of these experiences and be able to tell the stories of what is some of the magic in that. When I was going through my divorce, my first divorce, I didn't see any magic in it at first. I was so devastated. I was so upset that I was, 25 years old I had 3 babies at that point and hadn't graduated high school, had no education. And what was I going to do? I was devastated. And if I, at the time, would have had any comprehension of how beautiful my life was going to be, I would never have even doubted. I would have left way sooner than I did. But the time I had literally no idea, no comprehension about how amazingly beautiful my life was going to turn out. And now I feel like I'm in a point where I've spent the first portion of my life in creation of these 5 little humans that have turned into the most amazing people. And then I went through a second divorce and just lost myself completely hit rock bottom in a way that I had never experienced before. And I've been putting myself back together for the last about 7 years. And now I am in a point right now where I'm ready to create again. And this podcast is going to be one of my creative outlets. I don't have humans to create anymore. Yes, I have granddaughters that I love dearly and I try to interact with as often as possible. But I really wanted to have an outlet to have some level of creation so that I am value to my granddaughters, that I'm showing them this is what we do. We pick a hard thing and we dive in and we do it and we get it done. And this has probably been one of the scariest things I've ever decided to take on. I would say motherhood was definitely the most scary thing. But at the time, I didn't know that I had an option not to do that. That was just part of what you had to do. And so to willingly go into this situation and say, okay, here I am, this is what I want to do, has been a little terrifying, to be totally honest. So I'm really, really excited to be able to have an outlet in my life where I can create and I can bring, other people to an opportunity to be able to tell their stories as well. And I have some very exciting podcasts I'm really excited to put together. Obviously, I'm terrified of it as well, and posting, and actually publishing things. It's one thing to create the video. It's a whole nother thing to hit that publish button. So I'm really excited to be able to learn through some of these ups and downs and just share some of the knowledge and some of the knowings and some of the enlightenments and the way that I feel like at 20 years old, I decided to take a self-awareness class because I really wanted to be such a good mother. And that self-awareness class moved me to a point of realizing that I could create the life that I wanted. I didn't know that before. I thought that I had to live the life that was set out for me. And so when I took that class, I actually had hit a point in my life where I was very suicidal and had a suicide attempt at 20 years old. And I didn't know what else to do. I was so miserable and so sad. And I thought, this is my forever. And how do I get out of this? And so that launched me into a self-awareness class that literally opened my eyes to help me to see that I didn't know what I didn't know, and that there was this whole world out there to be able to learn and grow from. And I was in this tiny little box that I thought, this is the only thing that I can learn. This is the only thing that is acceptable to be able to learn. This isn't the only thing that's going to have my salvation and my children's salvation. And so when I took this class, all of a sudden, the world opened up to me and I could manifest the things that I actually wanted to. And dang, was I a good manifester. I really had manifested a lot of things in my life that I didn't even know were possible at points in my life. So that's been a very exciting adventure, is learning how to do those manifestations, putting my mind to something and saying, that's going to happen. And I proved that over and over and over in my life. And it was amazing as I look back on some of those things. It's amazing to look back and think, wow, I actually did those things. Wow, I had no idea that I even had that in me at the time. But being the oldest, I always felt like if I didn't know how to do something, then I would just figure it out. And I would say, if somebody would say, can you do this? And I'd, in the back of my mind, be like, absolutely no way. And then my mouth would open up and it would say, I got it, no worries. And I would just figure it out. And I knew that I was the grown up in the room and I could just make things happen. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older and went through a miscarriage that I realized I was fallible and human. And it was so, and I'll do a podcast around that too. So I have several different topics that I wanted to do these initial podcasts around. And that one really took me to the ground when I miscarried and realized that I wasn't superhuman and couldn't do every single thing that I thought I could do. And I just thought that I was the kind of person that just made it happen and figured it out along the way. And I look at my children now and how successful they are and how happy they are. It's not even, I'm looking at the emotional and the relationships success that they have in their lives. And I'm so happy and so proud to see who they are now. And so this is my next step, is to do the hard things, do the things that are scary. And so I'm really excited to be able to bring that to you in the form of a podcast. I do have several siblings who have been wanting to go public about the way that we were raised. And so I'm looking forward to being able to bring some of them onto the podcast as well, so that we can talk about things and talk about our stories, because it's definitely a traumatic way to be raised. Absolutely. There were so many good things about it as well. And as a child, I didn't know any better. And I just thought these things were amazing and life was amazing when we had the good times. But I didn't know how poor we were. I didn't know how abused we were. I didn't realize a lot of that things till I got older. Um, Now my dad is the leader of this extreme religious community, the Apostolic United Brother, and he is now the leader of that, which is now why a lot of my family members want to come forward and they want to tell their stories, because they've got their traumas and they've got their upsets, and I want to be able to have a platform that can tell those stories accurately and tell those stories with integrity. And who knows, maybe I'll have 2 or 3 of them on here at the same time. We'll see how that goes. But I'm really looking forward to the growth opportunity that this is going to be able to create for me, and for my ability to know that my voice can empower, can inspire, can call people to action and move people forward. And I really hope that you get something out of this podcast. I really hope that I relay some of that kind of energy on this podcast, because if a little girl comes in from this extreme religious community who is going to be nothing more than just a wife who bred children, and can go to owning a successful business, to having 5 children, to having a life that is incredible at this point, I feel like anyone can do it, and it's a story to be told. So come along with me on this journey. I'm excited to be able to share my story and help others to share their stories as well. So watch for more podcasts. I'm going to be doing quite a few of them, and I'll probably be making them once a week or so for the first little while, trying to get some more of them out there. Try to keep them about 30 minutes long so that they're not terribly long, but there's so much to say sometimes. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy to see where this is going to take us. So thank you for joining me today. I look forward to having the next one available for you soon.